She was also that year a fellow at Stanford University's Tobe Center for Jewish Studies. And the title of her talk today is A Reading of the Last Sentence of the Ethics from Spinoza to Scholem. Keren, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I think my talk will be echoing Zev Arvi's talk, as I have maybe a different understanding about the Hebrew grammar of Spinoza. And I will talk also about the idea that maybe there is something Maimonidean about Spinoza. An individual's library says a lot about their thought, their existence, their interests, their encounters, and who they are. We all have a library which we organize according to our own personal system. In 1941, the Argentinian author Jorge Luis Borges, who years later received the Nobel Prize in Literature, wrote a story about the Library of Babel, which he conceived of like the famous tower with the text forming a structure heavily influenced by the Kabbalah. I'll come back to the year 1941, as well as to the subject of the Kabbalah. The books in Professor Alan Nadler's library point to a keen interest in the Jewish influence on modern understandings of Spinozian thought, be they in Yiddish, German, and Hebrew. The linguistic approach looks at language, of course, but also at the cultural question of who was Spinoza. Someday, I hope to have the opportunity to explore the Nadler collection of rare books. I'd like to thank Professor Stephen Nadler for honoring me with an invitation to this exceptional symposium at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the Mosse Weinstein Center for Jewish Studies. Of course, I would have preferred to be with you in the United States, but freedoms have been restricted throughout the world. Ethical questions have come to the forefront of our daily lives, and ethics is an ancient issue, one that has been examined in depth by numerous philosophical, religious, anthropological, and literary traditions. The final chapter of the Ethics deals with a few notions I believe to be fundamental, ones that provide some insight into a few questions many of us around the world have asked. What is the meaning of joy, of love, of freedom? Spinoza's heterodoxy is well known. His emancipatory approach took certain religious terms and redefined them. From the perspective of language, his heresy stems primarily from his subversion of the meaning of certain sacred words. As to his aim, the philosopher was explicit, to explain not the meaning of words, but the nature of things. The terms joy and love are also found in Hebrew and then translated into Latin in his Compendium of Hebrew Grammar, a text published posthumously in 1677, the same year as the Ethics. The terms are, for instance, samach, joy, and ahava, love. For Spinoza, what matters is not only the meaning of words, but also the path one takes to reach that meaning, a path that he conceptualized using the geometric method inspired by Euclid, the Greek mathematician. This path is rationalist in nature and thus proceeds through a scientific logic structured around definitions, lemmas, propositions, demonstrations, and scholia. I'll be starting with the end of the Ethics instead of the beginning. I hope this doesn't ruin the plot for anyone. I'd like to talk to you about an exchange in Hebrew believed to have taken place in July 1941, and whose trace remains in the form of a letter that ends with the last sentence of the Ethics. But first, some additional context. What I will propose is an interpretation of a philosophical dialogue in Hebrew between two famous intellectuals about the end of this work by Spinoza. I will be also looking at its translations in Hebrew. In 1941, in Palestine, a philosophical debate took place between two young philosophers. The State of Israel hadn't been created yet, and their exchange occurred against the backdrop of World War II, at a time when the very existence of the Jewish people was endangered and when the world and its values were crumbling. The debate revolved around the very nature of Jewish philosophy, as well as its past and possible futures. So two young intellectuals boarded a bus, likely the number 9, which would take them down Mount Scopus to downtown Jerusalem, where they lived. The youngest was 38 years old, Yeshayahu Leibovich, a professor of biochemistry who, as far as I know, had yet not published any philosophical work. He had attended a lecture by Scholem, a 33-year-old specialist of the Kabbalah and professor at the newly formed Hebrew University of Jerusalem. So the two met in the bus, and during the bus ride, Leibovitz talked to Scholem about the lecture he had attended. The next day, he sent a letter to Scholem. This was in July 1941, and Tel Aviv had been bombed the previous months. Palestine was still under the British mandate. Between June 1940 and June 1941, the Regia Aeronautica had been leading air raids against Commonwealth forces in the Middle East. Many feared an invasion of Palestine by the Nazis via Lebanon. The issue of ethics, life, and survival was at the forefront during this period. The Yishuv had been bombed. There was widespread destruction, and the genocide of Jews was underway. How in the world, in this context, can one do philosophy? And even if one does, what would it be about? Human thought always develops in a context, and this context matters. A few months before this philosophical debate took place between Scholem and Leibovitz, philosopher Hannah Arendt had written a letter to Scholem. In the letter, she shared the terrible news about the suicide of their friend, the philosopher Walter Benjamin, and the extermination, writing, and I'm quoting, "Jews are dying in Europe and are being buried like dogs." Scholem brought her back 8 months later on July 17, 1941. Here is an excerpt from that letter, which he sent to Arendt in New York, where she had found refuge. "We'll just have to hack our way through this mountain of darkness, if I can say so. One senses the meaning of apocalyptic prospects in one's own flesh and blood." If ever there was a time to go back and reread Spinoza's Ethics, it was then. Unfortunately, I won't have time to develop too deeply into this very interesting letter between Scholem and Leibovitz. Leibovitz, a non-polemicist, is provocative in the letter. In his questioning of Scholem, he compares and contrasts the two main Jewish philosophical traditions, mystical philosophy, the Kabbalistic tradition, and rationalist philosophy, the Spinozan tradition. For him, the key to understanding this opposition lies in answering an historical question, and I translate from the Hebrew. How is it that the Kabbalah has so long gripped the minds and masses of Israel, whereas rationalist philosophy has remained of such limited interest to the public, and its traces were barely survived a few generations. In Leibovitz's letter, Scholem's position was depicted in these terms. The Kabbalah is closer to classical Judaism and breathes new life into religious institutions in terms of both the practice of the mitzvot and prayer. Scholem was a rationalist who studied beliefs and ritualistic aspects. He analyzed the mystical phenomenon, the Kabbalah, and Hasidic ecstasy. For him, mysticism is an interpretation of nature and divine revelations, Hitgalut. He believed in Judaism in the historical and Zionist sense as action in material reality as opposed to a simple idea or ideology. Scholem's inquiries focused not on the mitzvot themselves, but rather on questions of belief, the mystical experience, rituals to God, and supernatural phenomena. Leibowitz, on the contrary, was a rationalist who believed in God. He was interested in philosophy and politics and adopted the classical doctrine, which was to uphold all the commandments, the mitzvot. His letter ends with these words: "The sum of the matter, to counter your thesis that the Kabbalah is closer to classical Judaism, I would venture to propose this opposing thesis. The Kabbalah conquered the people of Israel because of its closeness to the pagan instincts against which classical Judaism struggled, but was unable to uproot. The philosophy of Maimonides did not vanquish for the reason that it adopted the line of the same classical Judaism that has always been and will always be the property of a virtuous few. It is not without consequence that Maimonides himself described the pure love of God as being something of which all the sages and wise ones were unworthy, but only our father Abraham. And this is also the sense of the words of Spinoza. Omnia praeclara tam difficilia quam rara sunt. But all things excellent are as difficult as they are rare. In other words, and we might be surprised by the profound implications of this position, a return to a philosophy related to classical Judaism would take place via a return to the sources of Maimonidean philosophy and through Spinoza's rationalist approach. The basis of this return is necessarily ethical, necessarily based on God. But he does not only say God, he is speaking about the love of God. What is it? For him, it clearly relates to faith. The total love of God is evoked each morning in the Shema, commanding us, and I quote, to love with all thy heart, thy soul, and thy might. It is the acceptance of the full sense of divinity. For Spinoza, what he refers to as the intellectual love of God is the end result of the ethics. Some people think that joy is excess, emotions overwhelming us. He completely rejects this idea. For him, intellectual wisdom is superior to the power of emotions. At the end of the last section of the Ethic, the rhythm changes, the style is more condensed, and the pace accelerates. Here, Spinoza signals the end of the traditional view of morals, or a series of prescriptions given by someone else. He supplants morals with blessedness, a concept which appears at the end of the work and represents an augmentation of power, the passage to a higher perfection. So, by way of conclusion, Leibowitz cites the following sentence in Latin, omnia praeclara tam difficilia quam rara sunt, which has been translated in countless ways in all languages. What are the implications of this phrase for the modern tradition of Hebraic philosophy, which was just emerging at the time? This sentence seems to refer to a text by Cicero and is believed to go back to Plato. As I said, it has been translated countless ways in different languages, English included. But everything excellent is as difficult as it is rare. But all things excellent are as difficult as they are rare. But all noble things are as difficult as they are rare. These multiple translations of the last sentence of the Ethics are not a mere affirmation, but a response to a final line of questioning formulated by Spinoza. Human beings try to understand the world around them. Now, this can take place through the imagination, emotion, and rationality. The end of ethics points to the human's separation from all imaginary and emotional elements in order to focus solely on pure knowledge as he defines it, which is to say, the essence of God and things. Intellectual love is not mystical or carnal, it emerges from knowledge. This is what is as excellent as it is difficult to attain, even for the sages. The intellect leads to freedom and blessedness. Blessedness is therefore pure knowledge and understanding of God, the end of one's enslavement to the affects. It is a difficult path with a difficult aim, even for the sages. Yet, for it to be possible, we must imagine it, aspire to it, rise ourselves up. Unlike in English versions, where the term praeclara is translated as excellent or noble, all the Hebrew translations of this Latin word have a point in common. In Hebrew, the translation is more clear-cut and uses a common root. Rubin, in the investigation of God with the science of man, Heker Eloah in Torat Adam in 1885, and Yaakov Klatskin in Torat Amidot, the Torah of Virtue, in 1924, both use the term Na'aleh. Yirmiyahu Yovel's translation in 2003, entitled Etika, uses the term Me'uleh, excellent. And I read it in Hebrew. אמנם כל נעלה הוא נשגב, כבד, ויקר מעט במציאות, רובין. כל דבר נעלה הוא קשה כשם שאינו שכיח, יעקב קלצ'קין. אבל כל דבר מעולה הוא קשה כשם שאינו נדיר, ירמיהו יובל. נעלה, מעולה, the root of both these terms is עלה, which means to go up, as in to go up a floor, but also the idea of raising or lifting oneself in the spiritual sense. But this term also has another meaning. It also encompasses the idea of rising in virtue, in the sense of improving oneself through study and closeness to God. Thus, the term Ilui, gifted in the study of the Torah. In Psalms, the Shir HaMa'alot, Songs of Ascents, also known as Songs of Degrees, were traditionally sung by the faithful during the ascent to Jerusalem. Looking at etymology, Maimonides is the one who forged a geometric dimension of ethics in the Hebrew language. He looked at ethics, midot, as having degrees, ma'alot, or levels. In his treatise on logic, Sefer Milot HaHigayon, Maimonides defined the term as Allah. He states, Yetaru hamidot b'ma'alot, which could be translated as describe the virtues in degrees, which means that intellectual virtues are to define the virtues in degrees, which is to say at the highest level. Each degree, each angle to a higher level is an extraordinary thing. It is interesting that in Hebrew, the term Ma'ala and Midah, both encompass the idea of geometry and ethics, which we might refer to as geometric ethics or ethical geometry. Ma'ala is both the rise or elevation, including in a spiritual sense, and the degree, while Midah means both measure and ethics, which accounts for the Hebrew titles of translations of the Heretic. But I still haven't told you anything about Scholem's response to this letter. So what was his response? As I prepared my lecture, I contacted the archivists at the National Library of Israel, hoping they could locate Scholem's response. Here's the response I received. Unfortunately, Scholem's response to Leibovitz, if there was one, is not in our records. The letter of Leibovitz, located in the Scholem archives, is merely a copy typed by Scholem himself based on Leibovitz's original letter. If such a letter exists, it may be held by the Leibovitz family. This letter must have been very important to Scholem since he typed it out himself and kept it. Years later, in 1973, Scholem wrote an introduction to the Kabbalistic work Puerta del Cielo by Abraham Cohen de Herrera, the same text that had been translated in Hebrew by Isaac Aboab da Fonseca under the title Sha'ar HaShamayim and published in Amsterdam in 1655. Isaac Aboab da Fonseca was one of Spinoza's teachers and was among those who issued his Keren, his excommunication. In his introduction to the text by Herrera, Scholem systematically outlined the parallels between this Kabbalistic text and the Ethics by Spinoza. Perhaps Spinoza's response to Leibovitz concerning the final sentence of the Ethics can be found in this introduction to Herrera. In a passage where he discusses Herrera and Spinoza's perspective on the oneness of God, Scholem makes a reference to chapter 69 of the Guide of the Perplexed. This is the only reference to Maimonides in the entire book. In this chapter, Maimonides discusses the subject of the creation of the world, Mosse Bereshit, and highlights an opposition between the Greek and Arabic philosophical traditions on the question of God. The root Allah, used by translators in the last sentence of the Ethics, has another meaning here, that of a divine attribute, but also a primary principle for understanding the universal order. Allow me to cite a passage from this chapter of the Guide of the Perplexed, first in Hebrew, then in English. הפילוסופים יקראו השם יתעלה העילה הראשונה והסיבה הראשונה. The philosophers, he refers here to the Greek philosophers, as you know, designate God, may he be exalted, yit'ale, as the first cause, ilah, and the first ground, siba. Yit'ale shares the same root as Allah, used to translate praeklara, excellent and noble. So that's what we can infer about Leibovitz and Scholem's interpretation of the last sentence of the Ethics, which started in an intense conversation on a bus. Thank you for your listening.